Heavy footsteps echoed down the courthouse hallway. Officer Grant blocked the way, spitting each word like a blade. "You think this place is for someone like you?" Leah clutched the law book tightly, her lips trembling but her gaze steady. "The law doesn't belong to just you." The wooden bench row fell silent. A few eyes turned away, and only sharp breathing filled the thick, suffocating air. Grant roared, his hand yanking her hair as he threw a cruel sneer. "Who's protecting you now?" A voice cut through from the shadows, tearing the room open. "Her father is the Attorney General of the United States." The courthouse hallway in the early morning was soaked in a cold, sterile light, the ceiling's neon bulbs casting pale reflections on the gray stone floor, freezing the space in a harsh stillness. Leah Carter stepped through the heavy door, clutching her law book like a fragile shield. Her face tilted slightly downward, eyes tense but fixed on the long, narrow corridor ahead where the footsteps of lawyers and court staff echoed in sharp, dry beats. Each step felt like walking on ice, where one wrong move could send her slipping. Her heart pounded, not just from fear, but from knowing this place was never truly safe for someone with her skin. Just as she reached the intersection, a woman in a dark blue uniform stepped into her path. Officer Grant, her face carved with disdain, scanned Leah from head to toe like inspecting something out of place. Her lips curled into a mocking smile, and her words dropped heavy into the already stifling air. "You think this place is for someone like you?" Grant's voice rang down the wide hall, making a few passing staff pause for a second before quickly walking on, pretending not to hear. Leah froze, her fingers gripping the edge of the book until they turned white. She didn't answer. Her head lowered slightly, as if pressing down every boiling thought in her chest. Humiliation surged, but no sound escaped. Any word at this moment could be twisted, used against her. The law book grew heavier in her arms, as if to remind her that justice still existed, but to hold on to it, she would have to wait for the right moment. The air thickened, and silence stretched tight along the hallway. People passed by, shifting to the side, not just to avoid trouble, but as if quietly siding with the power now looming over Leah. In that frozen second, a young law student approached from a distance, arms full of case files, his eyes flickering in alarm at the scene unfolding. He stopped, glanced around, then slowly reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his phone. The glow of the screen lit up in his trembling hand, the lens quietly capturing the two figures. No one noticed but him, yet his gaze carried a heavy resolve, as if he knew this moment had to be kept, no matter the cost. Grant stepped forward, her shadow stretching across the stone floor, swallowing the small shoes Leah wore. Her breath came out in short, sour bursts, laced with stale cigarette smoke that made the cold air even sharper. "Look up," she hissed, her voice cutting through her teeth. "I want to see the fear in your eyes." Leah trembled slightly, but kept her head bowed, shoulders tight. To her, the neon light above seemed to glare more harshly now, piercing into the darkness she was trying to hide. A glint of light reflected off the metal spine of the book, as if to remind her that silence had its own weight, that sometimes standing firm in the face of humiliation was a form of resistance. The moment stretched endlessly. Everything slowed, the distant echoes of footsteps, the ticking clock on the wall. Leah drew a deep breath, her hand shifting slightly to pull the book tighter against her chest, as if holding on to the last fragile pieces of belief she had left. Officer Grant glanced at that silence, mistaking it for weakness, and her contempt deepened. Her lips curled into a half smile, just enough to reveal the pleasure she took in seeing someone cornered. The law student still stood a few steps away, fingers clenched around his phone, eyes wide, heart racing. He knew he was crossing into dangerous ground. One visible move and Grant would turn on him, but the lens stayed open, capturing every frame, every cold glance, every sharp word. In that moment, courage was not in shouting, but in quietly holding on to the truth within a small, trembling hand. Leah lifted her head slightly, her eyes meeting Grant's for only a second. In that flicker, dark brown pupils sparked with resolve. Not a blazing fire, but the steady glow of burning coals. Grant flinched at the sight of it, surprised by that resistance, small and wordless as it was, yet filled with an unbending pride. To cover the falter, she let out a sharp, mocking laugh that rang through the cold corridor like metal scraping stone. Leah said nothing more, stepping slowly to the side, trying to pass, but Grant shifted again, blocking her, one hand resting on her belt, her stare daring a response. The tension thickened until the air itself felt drained. The law student swallowed hard, his heartbeat quickening with the sense that whatever he was witnessing might explode at any moment. The courthouse hallway, once meant only for solemn steps, had become a silent battlefield between a girl with a book and an officer drunk on power. One chose restraint, the other flaunted control, and in between them, the neon light continued to flicker, casting a cold glow on the stone floor, covering the scene in a light that felt both artificial and raw. In the tension of her breath, Leah kept walking, her palms damp with sweat, but her steps steady. She knew, from that moment on, every action, every glance, every word would become evidence. And right here, in this seemingly quiet hallway, a storm had already begun to form, waiting for the moment to break. Outside the courtroom door, where polished wooden steps led into a solemn chamber lined with benches and white pillars, the air thickened with hurried footsteps. A few young attorneys had just arrived, their coats still carrying the scent of early morning, arms clutching stacks of case files. They paused in the hallway, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes drifting occasionally toward Officer Grant, who stood blocking Leah Carter's path. Those glances weren't out of concern, but curiosity, like spectators waiting for a brief play to unfold right at the threshold of justice. Grant crossed her arms, shoulders stiff, then suddenly burst out with a sharp voice that cracked like a whip against the stone walls. The law doesn't save trash like you. Each word landed cold and hard, shattering the tension into countless sharp fragments scattered across the chilled floor. The young lawyers held their breath, some startled into looking up, others turning quickly away as if they'd heard nothing. A strange silence took over, broken only by the pounding of Leah's heart inside her chest. Leah raised her head, her eyes filled with tears but steady, a gaze like twin blades hidden beneath water. She clutched the law book tied against her chest, the rustle of paper faint in her trembling hands. Her voice rose, not loud, clear, cutting through the wall of silence around her. The law is meant to protect everyone. Each word struck like a blade, piercing through the power etched into Grant's smirk. The echo of her sentence rippled outward, reaching ears that had been pretending to stay busy, making a few young lawyers freeze, their expressions briefly unsettled. For a moment, the crowded hallway turned into a silent theater, where everyone became an unwilling audience. A faint whisper rose from a distant corner, a few heads shaking, a few eyes flickering with a mix of curiosity and unease, then quickly fading. No one dared speak, but the silence couldn't mask the swell rising in their chests. Because in this place of solemn rituals and symbols of justice, a policewoman had just spoken words that sent a chill down every spine. Grant narrowed her eyes, brows raised as if she couldn't believe the defiance, however small, from Leah. "What did you just say?" she hissed, her words dragging footsteps to a halt for a fleeting second. Leah didn't retreat, her lips pressed together, her eyes holding on to the last fragile thread that kept her upright. Her chest burned, but her breath stayed steady, as if every word she'd just spoken was a vow, not to provoke, but to remind herself that she was not wrong. The law student remained in the shadowed corner, phone trembling in his hand. He adjusted the angle, heart pounding as he realized what he was recording might become damning evidence. His lips moved slightly, a breathless whisper slipping out, "Unbelievable." The words weren't meant for anyone else to hear, not to share, but to remind himself that what he was witnessing was real, that some things must never be forgotten. A young lawyer nearby flashed a conflicted glance. He looked at his colleague, then at Grant, and finally lowered his gaze and walked away quickly. The sound of his shoes echoed across the stone floor, blending with scattered murmurs before vanishing into silence. That indifference gave Grant more confidence. She smirked, tilted her head toward Leah, her voice low but firm. "The law belongs to us, and people like you only get to listen, never use it." The words dropped like nails, driving straight into the already cracked wall between justice and reality. Leah closed her eyes for a moment, her fingers trailing along the spine of the book, feeling the sharp edges of the pages like tiny blades grazing her skin. She opened her eyes, her stare more resolute, her pupils glinting with quiet defiance. "Justice makes no distinction." The words came out calm, but rang through the air like a bell struck in the middle of the night. The nearby young lawyers paused again, some pressing their lips tight, others tapping their shoes nervously, as if they too were wrestling with what they had just heard. Grant growled, stepping forward, her heels slamming hard against the floor, the sound echoing sharply. She leaned in close, her breath hot against Leah's face, her eyes trying to crush what stood before her. "I've seen dozens like you. Every single one walks out of here with their head down. You think you're different?" Her voice seethed, every word landing like an invisible blow. Leah stood her ground, shoulders trembling slightly, but her gaze never dropped. From deep within that look, a quiet strength rose, not loud, not violent, but unwavering, something that made those who thrived on power feel deeply unsettled. Outside, early light crept through the tall glass windows, casting pale streaks across the tiled floor. Time seemed to hold still, stretching the tension until everyone held their breath. The law student inhaled deeply, feeling sweat run down his hand, but the phone never left its place. In his eyes, Leah stood like a small but unshakable monument, while Officer Grant appeared as the twisted face of abused authority. He knew this footage wouldn't just be a few random minutes, it might be the spark for a storm waiting to erupt. Leah turned her head, her eyes briefly meeting those of the law student, filming in secret. No words were exchanged, but that glance was a silent agreement that the truth had been passed on, that even if she were to fall, someone would preserve this moment. In that instant, she felt an unexpected calm, as if she had stepped beyond fear and reached a place of steady resolve. Grant let out a dry laugh, took a half step back, then moved in again, like a predator toying with its prey before the strike. "You'll never beat me," she said, her voice firm, as though delivering a sentence. But in that declaration, Leah suddenly saw the fear, because the truly powerful don't need to shout to prove their control. At the courtroom door, the intercom crackled, announcing that the hearing was about to begin. People flinched, hurrying inside, yet the weight of what had just unfolded still hung in the air, clinging to every cold corner of the hallway. Leah drew a deep breath, tightened her grip on the book, and stepped forward. The law student backed away, quickly slipping his phone into his pocket, his heart still pounding, knowing he had captured a fragment of truth that could never be erased. In that moment, beneath the polished light of Justice's corridor, the humiliation had been laid bare. One side believed silence meant surrender, but the other knew that silence could also be the wind-up for a stronger strike. And, in Leah Carter's unwavering gaze, a flame had been lit, ready to burn through the falsehoods parading in plain daylight. The hallway leading to the courtroom was unusually silent, the earlier flurry of footsteps now distant, leaving behind a long stretch of emptiness where pale yellow light spilled through the windows, casting Officer Grant's shadow across the marble wall. Leah Carter walked slowly with the crowd, pressing the law book tightly to her chest, her breathing quick but measured. When the others disappeared behind the heavy doors, she noticed footsteps still echoing behind her, steady and deliberate. Feeling cornered, Leah stopped and turned to see Grant approaching, her eyes cold, fixed like a predator closing in on its mark. Grant stopped close, leaned in until her breath hit Leah's ear, her voice low and sharp like a blade across the throat. "Around here, skin color decides, and you lose." Each word dropped like a shackle, weighing down on Leah's shoulders. Her body trembled, fingers gripping the book's spine so hard it felt like they might leave a dent. but a moment later, Leah bit her lip, her eyes flashing with defiance. She lifted her head slightly, met that cutting stare, and said quietly but firmly, "The more you talk, the more you expose yourself." That moment caught Grant off guard, though she masked it quickly with a dry, crooked smile. The challenge from a young girl bruised her pride. She stepped back half a pace, then moved in again, her presence forcing Leah against the wall. The sour mix of cheap perfume and old cigarette smoke wrapped around Leah like a net, thick and choking. But her gaze didn't waver, still fixed and steady, making the officer's attempt at intimidation feel hollow and uncomfortable. Footsteps suddenly echoed from down the hall. A young man in a blue dress shirt, holding a thick file, walked briskly past, then froze. His eyes flicked between the officer and the girl pressed against the wall, confusion and anger flickering across his face. Before he could speak, Grant turned sharply, barking, "You didn't see anything, got it?" The shout bounced off the walls and came back sharper, tightening the tension in the air. The young man lowered his head instantly, lips pressed tight, hands trembling around the file. He walked quickly to the end of the hall, but as he passed Leah, his eyes briefly met hers, a flicker of helpless solidarity shining through. He kept moving, but slid his hand into his pocket, quietly activating his phone's camera without Grant noticing. The wall mirror reflected him holding the phone low, recording the entire scene in silence. Leah knew that the small act was a lifeline. Inside her, the taut cord of fear shifted into a thin bridge between two strangers, both aware they were walking a dangerous line. Grant remained unaware, her aggression rising as she leaned in closer, her eyes blazing, voice sharp as a sentence. "I've broken plenty like you. They all leave in silence. I'll make sure you're no different." Leah swallowed a sharp breath, her eyes brimming with tears but refusing to let them fall. She knew Grant was trying to crack the thin shell of her resolve, but even as fear tightened around her chest, she spoke, slowly, clearly. "What you say won't erase the truth." Her voice was calm, not loud, but it rang like metal striking metal, enough to make Grant hesitate. In that brief moment, silence returned. The light pouring through the window stretched Grant's shadow across the wall, a looming phantom trying to swallow the small figure in front of it. Leah took a deep breath, then stepped sideways, slipping out of the pressure. Her hand still clutched the book tightly, as if it alone was giving her the last bit of strength she needed. The young man from earlier had disappeared down the hall, but the phone in his pocket was still recording, capturing the final seconds as Leah pulled herself away from the shadow of abuse. In that short clip, there was the harsh growl of Grant, the steady defiance of Leah, and the reluctant silence of a witness. Those seconds might seem to pass unnoticed, but once preserved, they could become fuel, just waiting for the moment to ignite. Leah walked faster, heart heavy, breath unsteady, yet a different kind of light flickered in her eyes. She didn't know who had recorded it, didn't know where the footage would go, but she knew a truth had just been planted into the tiled floor of that hallway. And someday it would rise like an explosion, exposing everything hidden beneath the polished gloss of justice. Behind her, Grant stood still for a long time, eyes fixed on Leah with a mix of hatred and confusion. She said nothing more, but her fists clenched tight, veins bulging, unable to hide the loss of control. The threat she had thrown hadn't broken Leah. Instead, it seemed to forge a layer of armor around her. In that silence, Grant realized that some people, even when pushed against the wall, refuse to bow, and that kind of resistance is more dangerous than any blow. The hallway fell silent again, the long streaks of light on the wall the only sign that a quiet confrontation had just taken place. Leah kept walking, her small frame merging with the crowd ahead, but her steps now carried a growing steadiness, and behind her, an unnamed witness held the truth inside a glowing phone, ready to become evidence for a coming quake no one yet saw coming. The courtroom blazed with overhead lights shining down on rows of thick wooden benches, where every gaze locked onto whoever walked in. Leah Carter entered, the law book still held tight to her chest, her hand slick with sweat but refusing to let go. The air was thick with solemnity, the neatly aligned rows making her feel like she was stepping onto a stage where everyone had come to watch a play. And right then, Officer Grant's sharp voice exploded, shattering the silence like a hammer striking stone. "This little girl's here to put on a black drama." The sound cut through the room, so cold and loud that a few people jerked their heads up in surprise. Curious eyes flared, a few looks laced with contempt skimmed across Leah like invisible blades. Grant stood tall, chest pushed forward, one hand resting on her hip like she was claiming the room as her own. Her face was flushed red, eyes blazing, each word dripping with humiliation, as if she intended to strip Leah down in front of everyone. Leah stopped in the center of the floor, light from the window casting her shadow long and narrow, small but solid. She took a deep breath, tightened her grip on the book, her fingers clinging to it as if drawing strength from the pages. Her eyes looked straight ahead, clear and unshaken. Her voice rang out, not trembling but firm. "I came here for justice." The words flew like an arrow, hitting Grant's arrogance head-on. The room stirred. From the back row, whispers rippled outward. Some people quickly raised their hands to cover their mouths. Others subtly shifted to grab their phones, the tiny lenses flashing and fading, capturing the tension. A few cleared their throats to mask discomfort. Others sighed, as if stunned that a young girl dared to speak back in such a formal space. Young lawyers seated near the aisle exchanged glances, expressions flickering with unease, recognizing the cruelty in Grant's words but saying nothing. Grant stepped forward, her heel slamming into the wood floor with a piercing thud, trying to crush any resistance Leah had left. Her face now burning, veins standing out on her cheeks, chin tilted high, her voice full of challenge. "Justice? Justice is the mask you wear to look noble. You're not here for the truth. You're here to stir trouble, to play the victim in front of an audience." Each word pounded the air like a hammer striking a wall already beginning to crack. Leah didn't back down. Though her legs trembled slightly, her hand clutched the spine of the book so tightly her nails dug into the cover. Her eyes now blazed, no longer hesitant, but sharp with the focus of someone who refuses to break. "If the truth makes you uncomfortable, then I'm not the problem," she said, her voice not loud but clear, carrying through the packed room. A sharp breath escaped from the rows of spectators, then silence fell again. A few people tilted their heads, their eyes shifting around, searching to see if anyone might step in. But most chose to stay quiet, pretending they were only there for work, ignoring what was happening in plain sight. Even so, phones were still quietly raised, screens glowing in the dim space, proof that the truth was being recorded. Grant clenched her teeth, her voice sharper, louder, trying to overpower Leah with sheer volume. "You think you're different? All of you are the same, thinking a few words from a book can save you from the truth. But in here, only I decide what's true." She stepped in closer, her imposing frame filling Leah's view. The room held its breath, as if any movement might trigger an explosion in what was supposed to be a place of justice. Leah didn't back away. Her eyes widened, catching the light until her pupils looked like they were burning. "The truth doesn't need anyone to decide it," she said quietly but firmly. "It exists, no matter how loud you shout." A louder wave of murmurs swept across the room, spreading like ripples. Some shook their heads, but more eyes shifted from curiosity to anger at Grant's behavior. Fingers moved quickly across phone screens, short clips being saved, ready to leave the room and spread far beyond. Grant sensed the shift, but instead of pulling back, her face flushed even deeper, like a cornered animal. She growled, raising her arm as if to block Leah's path, her eyes blazing, jaw clenched tight. The air was thick, Leah's heartbeat pounding in her ears alongside the growing hum of voices. Still, she stood tall, holding the book like a small shield, her gaze unmoving. In that moment, the room seemed divided. On one side was raw, aggressive power on display, on the other, fragile but unshaken resolve. Everyone watching knew that whatever happened next could change everything. This was no longer a personal confrontation. It was a public declaration. The gavel was about to strike from the judge's bench, signaling the session's start. But what unfolded below had already seized the room's full attention. Hidden cameras recorded, eyes locked in, breaths held, all drawn to the uneven standoff between a powerful officer and a young woman gripping an old book. Grant roared again, her voice cracking like thunder. "You're just pretending to care about justice, trying to win pity, and I'll make sure everyone sees you're nothing." She stepped in even closer, her flushed face just inches from Leah's. Hatred showed in every tense vein, every pulsing line across her temple. Leah didn't look away. Her voice dropped, but it cut sharply through the room like a blade slicing the dark. "I don't need pity. I need the truth." The clash of those two voices made the entire courtroom seem to tremble, as if an invisible quake had just struck. And, in that instant, everyone understood this was no longer an argument. It had become a turning point, the spark of a storm forming at the very heart of justice. In front of the bench, where white light spilled over the polished wood surface, everything felt stretched like a tightened string, ready to snap with violent sound. Leah Carter stood close to the podium, still clutching the law book like her final anchor, heart pounding in her chest. Around her, the audience benches were dead silent, a few phones half raised, hands trembling yet determined to capture every second. The gavel was about to strike from the judge's bench, but before it could fall, one sudden act ripped through the charged stillness. Officer Grant lunged without warning, her rough hand yanking Leah's hair back with force. The abrupt motion sent Leah stumbling, her feet nearly slipping on the carpeted floor. Long strands of hair flew loose in Grant's grip, and a cold laugh slipped from her lips. "Who's protecting you now?" The question hissed through the air like an invisible sentence, drowning the courtroom in a wave of suppressed outrage. Leah lost her balance, her body leaning sideways, and the book she had held so tightly slipped free. The law book hit the ground with a sharp smack that echoed through the wide chamber like the knock of fate. The sound bounced off the walls, striking every person packed into the gallery, freezing the room in a moment of collective shock. A female spectator gasped aloud, her voice trembling. "Oh my God!" The sharp cry shattered the silence like broken glass, but was quickly swallowed again. She covered her mouth and lowered her head, as if fearing that even a small sound could be turned into an accusation. The room fell silent once more, broken only by the rapid breathing of those too shaken to hide their emotions. Leah forced herself upright, shoulders trembling, but her eyes never dropped. She bent down, hands shaking as she picked up the book, now lying open on the floor. The worn cover bore fresh scratches from the fall, but she clutched it like it held her very breath. Her breathing heavy, she raised her head and looked straight at Grant. Her lips moved, voice low but unmistakably clear and sharp, slicing through the thickened air. "Not you." The words landed like a blade, cutting straight through Grant's display of dominance. The entire courtroom shook. Still reeling from the violence, people were now struck by the clarity of Leah's reply. Phones that had trembled in hesitant hands were now raised higher, lenses sweeping to catch every detail. They knew this moment could not be lost. It held the raw truth of power and resistance. Grant hesitated. She'd expected the hair pull to make Leah cry, bow her head, or at least fall silent. But instead of screams or pleas, there was calm. Leah had risen, the book in her hands now a symbol of endurance, and her answer had drawn a clear line for everyone present between cruelty and justice. The whispers rose into a swell, no longer containable. Someone murmured, "What did that girl just say?" Another voice answered, trembling, She said it's not the police who protect her. These short fragments of dialogue blended into a low wave that rippled through the room. Some faces turned downward, avoiding eye contact, but others looked up, their eyes lit with admiration. Leah still stood in place, her legs slightly shaking, but her spine held straight. She said nothing more. No explanation was needed. The words, "not you," were not just a rebuttal to Grant, but a declaration to everyone present. They exposed the truth that power in the hands of an abuser never equates to protection, that justice cannot come from a hand that drags the vulnerable to the ground. Grant clenched her jaw, her eyes bloodshot. She exhaled sharply, her cheek twitching with the fury of being publicly challenged. But in that very moment, the phones lifted in the air were capturing everything, turning her aggression into living evidence. She could yell, she could threaten, but she could not erase the eyes that had witnessed or the clips now being saved. Leah gripped the book tighter, the edge pressing into her palm like a reminder that she was still standing. Her eyes stayed fixed forward, ignoring the rage rising from Grant. In that moment, the packed courtroom fell completely still, as if everyone were waiting for the end of a lopsided battle. Once again, the gavel struck the judge's bench, its sharp crack meant to end the chaos. But it could not silence the echo of the hair yank, nor erase the words that had just been spoken. Even those who had tried to look away now felt a sting in their chest, because justice was no longer a distant abstraction. It had taken form here, in a young woman who dared to face humiliation and violence. Grant stepped back, trying to collect herself, but her flushed face and unsteady gaze betrayed the fracture beneath. Leah, though her shoulders trembled with each breath, projected a quiet strength that shifted the energy in the room. People no longer saw her as a fragile witness, but as a sharpened blade cutting through layers of oppression. The courtroom was steeped in unprecedented tension. Phones kept filming. Eyes stayed locked, and in the center of it all, Leah Carter stood firm, the book in her hands now a symbol challenging cruelty itself. She had proven that humiliation could shake a person, but not force them to bow, that violence could knock a book to the ground, but not dislodge belief in justice. In that moment, before the bench, justice had not yet been declared, but it was already present in Leah's answer, echoing through the room like a bell signaling the storm to come. The air in the courtroom was so thick it felt frozen in place. Even whispers were swallowed by a heavy silence that could crush anyone's chest. Dozens of eyes locked on a single point, where Leah Carter still stood, her hair disheveled from the violent tug, her hands gripping the law book like there was no strength left, yet refusing to let go. In front of her, Officer Grant's face was flushed, her eyes blazing with fury, ignited by the defiance she had just received. Grant leaned forward, her fiery gaze fixed on Leah, every muscle in her face pulled tight. Then she growled, each word carved into the air. "In here, I am the law." The sentence slammed down on the wooden floor, cracking into sharp, bitter fragments that made nearby spectators flinch. That arrogance echoed like a declaration of war, not just against Leah, but against the very idea of justice hanging behind the judge's bench. Leah raised her head, her eyes unblinking. Her pupils shone, not with rage, but the clear light of truth. Her voice rang out, firm and clean. "The law doesn't belong to a badge. It belongs to the truth." That sound shot forward like an arrow, piercing through Grant's proud armor, stopping her cold for a second. Hands covered mouths across the gallery, sharp inhales broke the silence, as if everyone had just witnessed a sudden counterstrike in an uneven battle. Before her words could even fade, the gavel struck from the judge's bench, its crack sharp as iron. The whole room jolted with it, but the tension didn't break. If anything, it thickened, settling like heavy smoke in a sealed chamber. The judge pounded again, scanning the courtroom with stern eyes, but the authority of that elevated seat suddenly felt dim compared to the confrontation unfolding beneath the witness stand. The law student had been silently recording all along, his hands now trembling. On his phone screen, every frame was crystal clear, from Grant's seething stare to Leah's strangely calm expression. He swallowed hard, heart racing, and whispered under his breath like a prophecy that demanded to be spoken. "This is going to blow up." The words were soft, but in the quiet room, a few nearby turned to him, their eyes flashing as they realized something was unfolding that reached far beyond a simple dispute. Grant clenched her fists, her nails digging into her skin until her knuckles turned pale. She lunged a step closer, her towering frame looming over Leah, trying to turn intimidation into a weapon. "You think you're smart?" she sneered. "The law is what I hold in my hand. I choose who gets it and who gets left behind. You're just a pitiful little girl who thinks a few lines in a book can change something that's been in place for hundreds of years." Leah didn't blink. Her hand trembled around the book, but her voice came out steady, unbroken. "Something that's lasted for hundreds of years doesn't mean it's right, and what you're saying only proves why justice needs to be reclaimed." The sound echoed like a long bell toll, striking the hearts that had been held in silence. A few spectators nodded gently, their buried frustration finding voice in Leah's words. The room seemed split in two, one side frozen by fear of power, the other stirred by the sudden courage of a young girl. Phones stayed lifted, short clips captured, ready to escape the heavy walls and spill into the wider world. The air was so tight that even a blink felt weighty, as if everyone were bracing for the exact second the spark would ignite. Grant let out a dry laugh, a sound not of amusement, but of pure mockery. She tilted her head, scanned Leah from top to bottom, then spat, "You'll learn the price of defying me." But as the words fell, Leah didn't lower her head. She stepped forward slightly, her eyes glowing, refusing to let the weight of authority cloud her stance. "I'm not defying you," she said slowly. "I'm reminding you of what you've forgotten. The law is not a tool for the powerful." For a moment, the room shook. People sat upright, eyes wide, unable to believe a young girl could speak so boldly at the edge of open threat. The sentence landed like a hammer, cracking the silence Grant had used to cloak her authority, and, in her eyes, a flicker of loss appeared, like a wounded animal roaring to protect its ground. The gavel struck again, but this time it couldn't drown the echo of their exchange. Phones kept recording, the pale glow of screens lighting tense faces, tight lips, trembling hands. The law student stared into his display, where Leah and Grant now stood locked in place, two opposing forces. He knew this footage, once it left the courtroom, would become a bomb no one could put out. Grant drew in a long breath, trying to reclaim control. She growled, "You'll regret ever opening your mouth in here." But Leah only pressed her lips together, tightened her grip on the book, and her gaze pinned to the space between them. "If I regret this," she said quietly, "justice loses another defender, and I won't let that happen." Her words lit something in the room. A few people glanced at one another, their eyes bright. They didn't clap, didn't speak, but in the quiet, flame had caught, spreading through shared glances and subtle nods. Grant felt the shift, the loss of control, and her face turned a deeper red. She stepped back, half a pace, but her eyes burned with spite, because deep down, she knew she had lost the most dangerous thing, the silence of the crowd. In the packed courtroom, everyone was pulled into the weight of that brief exchange. No one paid attention to the thick files on the tables anymore, or the legal procedures that had once filled the schedule. What they witnessed wasn't a hearing. It was a direct collision between force and faith, between abuse of power and truth. And, in that moment, they knew that no matter how it ended, this story wouldn't stay inside these four walls. The final gavel struck, forcing the room into silence, but inside each person, the sound that truly echoed was Leah's voice, the one that turned a heavy courtroom into a place where the fire of justice had been lit. The law doesn't belong to a badge. It belongs to the truth. The hallway, outside the courtroom, usually buzzing with the sound of heels on tile, rushed conversations over case files, and the shuffle of people coming and going was now steeped in a heavy, tangled atmosphere. The breathless confrontation inside had left a weight on everyone who witnessed it. As the heavy wooden doors closed again to prepare for the next proceedings, clusters of people formed just outside, whispering in shaky, curious voices. A middle-aged man man leaned toward his friend, lowering his voice just enough for a few nearby to catch. "That girl, she's not just anyone." The words dropped like a pebble into still water, sending ripples through the attention of those around. A young woman in a dark blue suit, clutching a thick file, responded quickly, her voice dropping into secrecy. "They say her father's some kind of high-ranking official." Her eyes flickered with suspicion, darting toward the doors that had just shut. Those within earshot turned to whisper among themselves, a rising wave of murmurs spreading down the corridor like dry grass catching fire. The rumor, whether true or not, carried weight. It explained Leah Carter's startling composure, her boldness in standing up to a powerful police officer where others would have stayed silent. All eyes turned toward Leah as she stepped out of the courtroom. She still held the law book tightly to her chest, her face calm, eyes still holding the last traces of tension but refusing to lower. The whispers grew louder, swelling like waves crashing toward her, each step heavier than the last. Someone whispered, "Is it true? Her dad's some big shot?" Another voice answered quickly, "If that's the case, Grant picked the wrong one to mess with." Every comment struck like sparks, and the rumor flared even hotter. Behind her, Officer Grant walked close, heels pounding in a steady, aggressive rhythm, her posture proud to cover the brief falter within. She heard every word exchanged, felt the shift in glances around her, no longer just curious but wary, calculating. The unshakable confidence Grant had relied on for years now bore a visible crack. Still, she held her head high, lips curled in a sneer, her eyes sweeping the hallway as if daring anyone to challenge her. Leah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the rumors thickening around her. She knew they could cut both ways. If people believed she was just the daughter of some official, they might dismiss her stand as privileged, erasing her effort to hold firm on her own. But, with her gaze fixed ahead, Leah kept walking calmly, each step a quiet declaration that she hadn't come here to hide behind a name. The book in her arms, not her father's title, was the only thing giving her strength not to bow. The clusters of people kept whispering, each word fired like arrows into the air. A deep male voice murmured, "I heard she's the daughter of the Attorney General of the United States." The sentence struck like lightning, making the entire group turn to each other in shock. The murmurs spiked instantly, and some raised their phones to text, to pass along the breaking piece of gossip. The already suffocating hallway now burned with the spread of that single phrase. Grant faltered for a moment at the sound of the title. She turned her head toward the crowd, a flicker of unease flashing through her eyes, something Leah felt too. Still, Grant kept her proud expression locked in place, lips tight in a hard line, eyes back on Leah as if daring the rumor to shake her. She quickened her pace, trying to close in on Leah, hoping that her looming presence would be enough to smother the wildfire starting to catch beyond the courtroom. Leah paused for a moment as a group of young lawyers blocked her path. They said nothing, but their eyes held unspoken questions. She tilted her head slightly, lips pressed in a soft line, offering no reply, and moved past them, letting their stares linger behind her. Inside, every whisper felt like a new test, but she knew the only way forward was through a steady, unshaken silence. Behind them, the spectators were now speaking more boldly. One insisted, "I'm certain she's the Attorney General's daughter. The way she spoke, the way she looked at Grant, that's not just anyone." Another cut in, voice sharper, "If that's true, Grant's done for." These lines threaded into every ear nearby, thickening the air with anticipation. No one knew what was true anymore, but curiosity had turned into a fever, where every word sparked wildfire. In the midst of that chaos, Leah kept walking. Each breath felt like a lifetime, but her gaze never left the path ahead. She knew the rumor would escape this narrow courthouse hallway soon enough and flood the world beyond. And when it did, nothing would go back to the way it was. But she also knew this needed to happen, because truth could not stay buried forever. Grant followed, her eyes still fierce, but deep inside an unease had taken root. The name Attorney Attorney General wasn't one to be dismissed, and if the rumor held even a sliver of truth, her own actions might become a stain she could never scrub away. Yet, like any predator trained in dominance, Grant clung to her arrogance, masking the cracks widening beneath her confidence. The hallway buzzed on, whispers refusing to die. The rumor had sparked, and whether true or not, it was already blazing. And in the middle of it all, Leah Carter walked as if she heard none of it. But inside, she knew. This was the turning point. The whispers were becoming echoes, and soon, the world outside would be listening. The courtroom, already packed since the trial began, now felt compressed to the point where even breathing became heavy. Wooden benches creaked as people pressed in tighter, all eyes pulled forward by some invisible force. Leah Carter stood at the center, the law book in her hands still trembling with tension, but her face no longer carried the panic it once had. Instead, there was a calm in her gaze, an unreadable stillness that sent a chill through anyone who had been waiting to see her break. Officer Grant looked like someone pushed to the edge. Her cheeks flushed red, fingers clenched so tightly the veins in her hands bulged. In the suspended silence, her voice rang out, shrill and sharp, exploding like a blast. "You have no one. You're just a trembling black girl." The words tore through the thick air, cutting into every ear, triggering a wave of reactions. Some grimaced, others lowered their heads like dodging a blade slicing through the room. And then more phones were raised, lenses zooming in on Grant, capturing every word she had just hurled. Leah didn't react right away, as if letting each cruel word pass, fall onto the cold tile floor, and shatter. She drew in a deep breath, fingers tightening around the book, then slowly raised her head. Light from the window fell across her face, illuminating it, her eyes gleaming with something deeper, steadier, as if powered by a force beyond herself. When she spoke, her voice wasn't loud or shaking. It was deliberate, every word clear enough to still a room. "I have a father, and my father is the Attorney General of the United States." In that moment, the courtroom erupted. Gasps burst out, rising into a tidal wave of noise. People shouted, others whispered frantically, and some lawyers dropped entire stacks of papers, files flying across the room, chairs scraped, shoes pounded the floor, and camera shutters snapped wildly. The space split in chaos, stunned expressions frozen on faces that couldn't process what they were hearing. No one had expected that the girl in the center of the storm carried a name powerful enough to shake the entire justice system. Grant froze. For a brief second, every trace of arrogance and aggression on her face vanished. Her eyes widened, darting around, searching for something solid and finding nothing. Her foot slipped half a step back, heel tapping the floor with a dull thud that betrayed the tremble in her body. Her face drained of color, sweat breaking across her temple. For the first time all morning, Grant lost the total control she had convinced herself she possessed. Phones shot into the air at once, their blue screens lighting up the entire courtroom. Every lens zoomed in on Grant's face, capturing her pale, shaken expression. Camera shutters clicked non-stop. Recording icons blinked in unison, creating a chaotic but synchronized orchestra of reaction. Everyone understood this was a moment that couldn't be missed. It was the living proof of an abuser's collapse in the face of undeniable truth. Leah stood still, her shoulders still trembling slightly, but her spine straight. The words she had just spoken were not just a public claim of identity, but a shot signaling a complete shift. Her gaze held steady on Grant, not smug, not gloating, just calm, as if to say, truth doesn't need decoration to be powerful. In her eyes, people no longer saw a victim, but a symbol of a growing wave of resistance ready to break loose. The murmurs hadn't even faded when a woman in the back row suddenly cried out, "Attorney General!" Her voice rang with shock and fear. Instantly, the noise swelled like a crashing tide. Phrases like "unbelievable," "Grant's done," and "something big is coming" rippled through the room. Every word, every whisper was a small spark feeding the growing fire. Grant forced herself to stand tall, trying to reclaim her usual pride, but the dominance had drained from her eyes. In its place was panic, thinly masked behind a crooked smile. She stammered, trying to speak, but her throat burned dry and no full sentence made it out. She knew, no matter how she flailed, Leah's revelation had sliced through the false armor of power she had built for years. Leah didn't look back, didn't seek approval from the crowd. She only tightened her grip on the book, her heartbeat pounding as if trying to break free from her chest. In her mind echoed the image of her father, the man who had always taught her that justice didn't live in the power of a high seat, but in the courage to speak when others stayed silent. And now she had done exactly that. The judge's gavel struck again, this time louder and more frantic, but it couldn't cut through the storm rising in the room. The courtroom had shattered into 1,000 pieces, and no legal formality could stitch it back together. The truth was out, and from the moment Leah spoke, every eye and every lens had shifted focus. The courtroom was no longer a space Grant controlled. It had become a stage where her false authority was stripped bare before the public. Footsteps echoed in chaos as several people rushed into the hallway, phones pressed to their ears, relaying the breaking news. Attorney General's daughter assaulted by police. The phrase was repeated, passed from one mouth to another, ready to break beyond these four walls and explode into the world outside. Grant forced a mocking smile, but her pale face and anxious eyes betrayed her. She knew this wasn't just a momentary failure. It could be the end of her career and reputation. And more than that, she understood that with cameras still rolling from every angle, there would be no room left to recover. Leah took a deep breath, closed her eyes briefly to steady her rhythm, then opened them with a clear, unwavering gaze. She knew the road ahead would be even harsher because revealing her identity meant carrying a massive weight. But in this moment, before all the stunned faces, she had proven that fear could be overcome, that justice, once named, held the power to defeat even those once thought untouchable. The courtroom was packed, but inside every person, the brief silence following the chaos echoed like a battle drum. They knew this wasn't just a personal case, but a complete fracture in a system once believed to be invincible. And from this moment on, the entire world outside would be watching. No one could turn away anymore. That afternoon, in a small cafe near the law school, the usual noise of coffee machines and chatter suddenly shifted when a phone on the table lit up. On the screen appeared a short video clip, barely a minute long, capturing the moment Officer Grant yanked Leah Carter's hair right in the courtroom. The cafe seemed to fall quiet, and every pair of eyes in the student group around the table locked onto the screen. The chaotic courtroom sounds mixed with the gasp of a spectator, freezing the group in stunned silence, followed instantly by a wave of sharp reactions. A male student muttered through clenched teeth, "A cop did that in court?" The group erupted, angry voices overlapping, fingers tapping furiously to rewind the clip. Each time, Leah's hair was pulled and her book hit the ground with a thud. Fists tightened, young faces burning with both outrage and disbelief. Within minutes, the video had been shared in the class group chat, then quickly spread to others around campus. Comments poured in, shock, furious, relentless, like a wave crashing through any remaining silence. Amid the outrage, hashtags began to appear. One student typed quickly, #Justice for Leah, so everyone sees cops can't abuse power. Another added, #courtroom abuse. We have to speak up. Each post added fuel, pushing the clip from a private circle to the verge of explosion. Within a few short hours, the number of shares soared, each phone becoming a tiny torch passed from hand to hand, lighting up a story once trapped behind the heavy doors of the courtroom. A girl sitting nearby, not part of the student group, caught a glimpse of the video, and her eyes widened. She opened her laptop right there and uploaded the clip with the caption, "Where is justice when a girl is assaulted at the foot of the bench?" Her post drew thousands of shares and quickly reached forums far beyond law students. In that little cafe, no one expected a shaky-handed video to break through brick walls and reach the wider world. As dusk fell and sunlight faded behind the cafe's windows, the air inside had changed. Screens glowed, message alerts chimed non-stop, furrowed brows and angry stares reflected in the glass. Phones passed from hand to hand. The same clip played again and again, and heads shook in disbelief. Some let out bitter laughs, others could only mutter, "Can't believe this is America." Slowly, the once busy cafe became filled with heated conversation, the click of keyboards and the heavy weight of a truth just exposed. Leah wasn't there to see her own video spreading, but the image of her in that clip had already begun changing the way people looked at her. No longer just a solitary witness, she had become a symbol of injustice exposed inside the very house of law. And while social media lit up with angry words, the public understood this was only the beginning of a storm that could not be stopped. The hashtag #Justice for Leah first appeared on a law student's post and was shared hundreds of times within minutes. Those few short words carried a weight far beyond a slogan. They became a banner for the community's collective outrage. Screenshots from the clip showing the moment Grant pulled Leah's hair were reposted with the hashtag spreading like wildfire. People didn't just hit share. They added comments, each one a blade cutting deeper into the public's already fractured trust in law enforcement. On social platforms, attention turned to Leah with lightning speed. Comments poured in, a flood of anger and pain falling like an unending cascade. She didn't deserve this. Anyone could be Leah if justice keeps being twisted. Petitions calling for an investigation were created, the first signatures appearing, climbing quickly from hundreds to thousands. That unity gave people strength. They no longer felt alone, but part of a growing movement awakening around them. At the same time, the media began to move. Small, student-run publications were the first to report, using the now viral video clip as the core of their stories. Headlines were sharp and simple. Police assault in courtroom. Where is justice for Leah? That article ignited the rising wave further. Independent journalists, always chasing truths outside the mainstream, followed quickly with stronger angles. When major news outlets started paying attention, hashtag Justice for Leah had already climbed to the top of trending topics. In discussion forums, debate exploded. Some questioned whether the clip was staged, but those claims were quickly countered by first-hand accounts from people inside the courtroom. Witnesses began sharing their stories, their details aligning, forming a vivid chain of evidence that was hard to deny. Each testimony added a piece to the larger picture, and the more pieces emerged, the clearer the truth became, until no one could look away. The power of the online crowd began to exert real-world pressure. Civil rights organizations and human rights groups quickly joined in, issuing official statements demanding a transparent investigation. A number of young lawyers shared the video along with public promises to represent Leah pro bono if needed, calling it their duty in the face of such blatant abuse of power. Universities also stirred, with students gathering in small groups to discuss organizing peaceful rallies to express their stance. With every passing hour, the number of posts, shares, and comments surged. The angry messages spread beyond local boundaries, translated into multiple languages. Leah, once a girl publicly humiliated inside a courtroom, suddenly became the face of an international wave against injustice. As the hashtag appeared on millions of screens, it stopped being a personal story and turned into a collective call for everyone who had ever suffered under the hand of those sworn to uphold the law. In that atmosphere, silence was no longer an option. People wrote, shared, recorded reaction videos, and even took to the streets holding banners that read, "Justice for Leah." The outrage transformed into action, and everyone knew that the more voices joined in, the harder it would be for the truth to be buried. The wave that started online was no longer just rising. It had become a sweeping storm, threatening to wash away every denial and cover-up. In the middle of it, Leah was no longer just a lone girl standing her ground, but a symbol that united a society now rising beside her. Inside the formal chamber of the Department of Justice, the camera lights beamed directly onto the face of the Attorney General. Behind him, the national flag draped evenly across the wall, creating a backdrop of solemnity and authority. The press conference had been called urgently, with dozens of reporters packed into the tight space, recorders and cameras pointed at the podium. The tension was so high that every breath felt amplified, as everyone waited for the confirmation that could shift the entire narrative. The Attorney General stood tall, eyes sharp behind his glasses, hand steady on the podium, and his voice rang out firm and clear. "No one stands above justice." The first sentence echoed through the room like a ringing bell. Reporters looked up, pencils scratched hastily, and camera flashes went off in rapid bursts. He paused for a few seconds, eyes sweeping across the room, then continued, his voice calm but resolute. "I confirm, Leah Carter is my daughter." A dead silence fell, followed by a shock wave. Sharp inhales spread through the crowd. Reporters dashed into the hallway to break the news to their desks. And inside, phones vibrated in unison with breaking alerts. His words weren't just to acknowledge his daughter, but a message directed at anyone who thought they could abuse power in the shadows. He went on, "A police officer assaulted my daughter in a courtroom, where justice must be upheld above all else. This is no longer a family matter, it is a national concern." His voice was unwavering, each word hitting with the force of truth. The reporters, long used to drawn-out political statements, now found themselves gripped by every breath as each tone carried raw truth and undeniable authority. The live broadcast carried the press conference across the country. People sat in front of their screens, following every word from the Attorney General. Some clenched their fists, others held back tears, overwhelmed with anger and solidarity. Leah, once a girl humiliated in a courtroom, was now being named on national television. That image fueled an even stronger wave, with thousands of social media comments exploding within minutes of his final sentence. He ended the address with a promise: "We will investigate this to the end. Justice is not a curtain to shield power, but the foundation that protects everyone. No officer, no institution has the right to stand outside this truth." The words echoed, and the press conference closed amid a storm of reactions. As he stepped away from the podium, his firm voice still reverberated through the room, and the public understood that the storm had reached the center of power, and there would be no stopping it now. All those who abuse power will be held accountable. The Attorney General's firm words struck the room like a hammer breaking the silence. In that moment, no one bothered to jot down notes. They only looked up, knowing these were not just ordinary remarks, but a sentence directed at anyone who ever believed power could shield wrongdoing. Cameras captured his blazing eyes and unmoving stance like a monument etched in stone, and that image was instantly broadcast across television networks. Families sitting in front of their screens felt the impact as if the words had been spoken directly to them. No longer was there a divide between the man at the podium and the people watching. The media exploded within minutes. Emergency broadcasts aired on repeat, with bold red headlines flashing, "Attorney General vows crackdown on abuse of power. His daughter identified as victim in courtroom assault." Images of Leah during the hair-pulling incident resurfaced everywhere, this time accompanied by detailed analyses and furious commentary. Major news outlets launched special coverage, from New York to Los Angeles. The story of Leah, Officer Grant, and the Attorney General's fiery statement flooded every screen. Online, the outrage rose like a storm. The hashtag #Justice for Leah shot to the top of the national trending list, generating millions of comments. People shared the video, screenshots, and quotes from the press conference, building a massive wall of evidence that no one could ignore. Emotional posts filled the feed. "Today, Justice spoke. We can't allow another Leah." The momentum shook the political landscape, forcing senators and governors to issue public responses. In cities across the country, Small groups began gathering in public squares, raising banners demanding transparency and justice. Their chants echoed through the already taut atmosphere. Footage of these rallies was shared widely, sparking a rare sense of unity. From workers and students to teachers and young attorneys, all joined the swelling tide of anger, embracing Leah as a shared symbol. This collective force grew so large that even silence started to seem suspicious. TV pundits spoke bluntly. This isn't just about one incident. It's the moment the entire system has to face itself. A seasoned journalist remarked when the Attorney General said, "All those who abuse power will be held accountable." He staked his political reputation and career on this fight. That resolve pushed public sentiment to its peak, transforming the story from a viral video into a national reckoning. In every home, every coffee shop, every office, people spoke of Leah, of the thunderous declaration, as if all were united by a single question: would justice truly be served? Yet even amid lingering doubt, everyone had to admit the landscape had shifted, because when the media exploded and the nation trembled, no one could look away anymore. Those few resolute words had carved themselves into the collective consciousness, beating like a war drum, signaling that the real battle had only just begun. At the Department of Justice headquarters, thick stacks of files piled high on the large wooden table, papers scattered across the surface, interspersed with steaming cups of coffee. The air inside the closed room was suffocating, filled with the constant sound of flipping pages and clacking keyboards. The federal investigation team had been summoned urgently, every face marked with tension. They knew this was no longer an isolated act of violence, but a national flashpoint. The review began overnight, each link tied to Officer Grant pulled into the light. The lead investigator laid out the initial evidence in the center of the table, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep but firm. He ordered the collection of all courtroom video footage and summoned every witness present. The other investigators quickly opened their laptops, accessing the courthouse camera system to extract each frame. On screen appeared the moment Grant yanked Leah's hair, the courtroom noise erupting. Some angles were blurry, but the act was far too clear to deny. A female agent leaned down, writing forcefully into her notebook, underlining the phrase, "direct act of violence in public view." The team didn't stop at the viral clip. They tracked down independent footage from various sources. Audience members' phones were reviewed, and short videos were synced to reconstruct the full timeline. Some clips were shaky or distant, but still showed Grant's aggression and Leah's composed response. These pieces were assembled into a seamless sequence, proving the events unfolded in real time without edits. Meanwhile, another group combed through Officer Grant's personnel file. Each disciplinary report was pulled from its drawer, past complaints revisited. The numbers weren't small. Multiple incidents involving excessive force against people of color. Numerous internal reviews marked by a lack of transparency. Everything was flagged in red, stacked into a thick dossier. A young investigator glanced at the data and shook his head slightly, muttering under his breath, this wasn't the first time. The words echoed in the heavy air, making everyone more aware of the case's gravity. The large screen in the conference room continued to show clearer angles, this time from the ceiling-mounted camera. The footage displayed Leah's head yanked back, her body lurching. The book hitting the floor with a dull thud. The dry sound made the entire room go silent for a few seconds, no one looking away. The lead agent nodded slightly and motioned for the clerk to archive the entire clip as key evidence. His voice was slow but heavy with meaning. This will be the cornerstone of the entire hearing. The investigators worked through the night, white light casting over tired but focused faces. Every file was numbered, every video clip stored and copied. Not a single detail was overlooked, because they knew transparency this time wasn't just for Leah, but to answer the millions of eyes watching from outside. When the screens finally went dark at dawn, the room still carried a heavy air. Those present stood up, each step weighed down, but their eyes remained resolute. They knew the real battle was only beginning, and justice could only exist if the truth was laid bare. The witness list was issued the following morning, each name marked in red on the Justice Department's internal documents. The doorman, young attorneys, law students who were present, and even the woman who had cried out were all summoned. Phones rang nonstop in the office, each call delivered in a firm tone. You are requested to appear at the federal headquarters to provide a statement. Every call carried the weight of an entire system entering a phase of investigation. Some witnesses hesitated, afraid of retaliation, but once they saw the video spreading everywhere, they knew that staying silent now would only make them accomplices. The Justice Department's interview room became the place where witnesses were received. The woman sat down, her hands still trembling, her voice breaking as she recalled seeing Leah's hair yanked. She spoke slowly, each word landing heavily, prompting the officer taking notes to look up. The law student brought the very phone that recorded the clip, replaying segments for the investigators, shaky footage but packed with truth. The different testimonies were pieced together, forming a surprisingly consistent picture. There was no room left for denial. Every detail aligned with the original video. While statements were being carefully gathered and recorded, the atmosphere at the police department felt like a pressure cooker. Officers passed each other without making eye contact, voices low, eyes avoiding. Some pretended to be busy with paperwork, and others locked themselves in their offices. Everyone knew that if the investigation followed through, many long-buried secrets would surface, and no one could be sure they'd escape the fallout. The station's hallway, once filled with chatter and laughter, now echoed only with heavy footsteps. Every phone call from the Justice Department was a thorn, making officers flinch. Whispers filled the break room, fearful that Grant might name others who had once protected her. The rising panic turned what was once the headquarters of justice enforcers into a house set ablaze, where even a single spark could bring the whole system crashing down. The federal investigators understood that mindset well. They weren't in a rush, but each of their steps added more pressure. From reviewing disciplinary records to summoning witnesses, everything was carried out meticulously, creating the sense that no gap could slip through unnoticed. A veteran officer sat in a private room, clutching a cigarette without lighting it, sweat beading across his forehead. He knew the days of safety under the shield of his peers were over, and if he didn't prepare a proper statement, he himself could be pulled into the case. As the day wore on, the tension became more pronounced. The evening news aired images of witnesses entering the Justice Department, accompanied by confirmation that the investigation was moving in the right direction. People watched, comments flooded social media, and pressure on the police department mounted. Every scrutinizing gaze from the public became a flame, turning the precinct into a bed of hot coals that couldn't be cool. Everyone understood that even a single unfavorable conclusion could drag the entire department into a brutal storm that no one would escape. Inside the closed meeting room of the police department, the cold gray-painted walls only deepened the heavy atmosphere. The fluorescent lights cast down over a long table covered in files, each stack marked with red sticky notes like open wounds still bleeding. The federal investigators sat across from department leadership, no one smiling, no small talk. The lead investigator opened a thick file and dropped it onto the table, the loud thud shaking the entire room. His voice was clear and firm. This is the full complaint history against Officer Grant over the past 10 years. Pages turned one by one, the dry rustling echoing like a gavel strike. Line after line of numbers appeared, each one a case previously filed. From excessive force during arrests to verbal abuse laced with racial slurs, all had been recorded. Some reports explicitly stated the victims were people of color, pulled over without cause, searched without legal grounds. The room fell silent as the evidence was laid bare, leaving no room for denial. A young officer in the corner lowered his head, his clenched hand pale white, remembering the time he witnessed Grant verbally abuse a black teenager, and how everyone had chosen silence. The racial harassment cases were no longer isolated incidents. They piled up into a list so long, even the most seasoned investigators furrowed their brows. One investigator read aloud, "The victim reported being shoved to the curb by Officer Grant, called slurs, then threatened not to report it." The black ink on white paper cut like blades into an already fractured trust. No one in the room dared to deny it, because the proof was right in front of them. The truth, now exposed, didn't just indict one individual, it unmasked an entire system of protection. The lead investigator stared directly at the department's leadership, his voice icy. Why were so many of these files marked internal resolution and quickly closed? No one answered. A few looked down, others stared blankly at the pages, desperate to escape that unflinching gaze. The silence dragged on like an unspoken confession. Eyes shifted between colleagues, cracks in the ranks now visible as everyone feared being pulled into the investigation. One of the investigators turned on the big screen, projecting a series of digital documents showing past warnings issued to Grant. Each report listed detailed misconduct, but always ended with the same line: insufficient evidence to proceed. The repetition of that phrase felt scripted, exposing a deliberate pattern of suppression. A few heavy sighs broke the stillness as all present realized their silence had helped foster Grant's unchecked power. The white glow from the screen reflected across the officers' faces, exposing confusion and fear. One stood up, voice hoarse. "We can't keep denying this." That sentence struck like a spark setting the room ablaze, marking the moment the final lies were forced out. The lead investigator closed the thick file, his voice low and firm. "The truth is clear. This is no longer a personal matter. This is the system." In that moment, a room once ruled by the silence of authority was laid bare by documents long buried. Everything once hidden, insults, violence, now surfaced like a massive indictment. And everyone present understood they were not just witnessing the fall of a single officer, but the unraveling of an entire structure once thought unshakable. Inside the stifling meeting room, no one spoke as more files hit the table with a dull thud. The white light from the large screen illuminated every page, every report, but only deepened the weight in the air. The officers sat in silence, hands clasped, fingers fidgeting with pens, eyes carefully avoiding the federal investigators. Silence blanketed the room like a heavy quilt, pressing down on every breath. One man bowed his head so low his shoulders trembled, yet no words came. Others stared at the grain of the wooden table, as if searching for an escape in its cold, carved lines. At that moment, the lead investigator scanned every face, reading the bowed heads as confessions that required no paper. No one had to say it. Everyone knew those dense records didn't disappear by chance. It took agreeing hands, silent nods, quiet signatures in the dark. The silence of the group became louder than words, revealing that Grant had never acted alone. She was the executor, but behind her stood a network long conditioned to look away, letting her actions go unchecked for years. That truth chilled the room further. A young investigator, face still unweathered by compromise, looked around and met only lowered eyes. He swallowed hard, lips parting as if to speak, but he too fell silent, because he understood. The truth here had grown beyond any one individual. It had become a culture embedded in the system. The bowed heads were not just about fear. They were habit, born from years of staying quiet to stay safe, from turning others' wounds into faint shadows in official reports. The lead investigator closed the file, his hands clasped in front of him, voice cold but clear. "This isn't about one person. This is the system." The words hit the silent wall, bounced and spread, making a few officers flinch in their seats. They couldn't argue. Every number, every complaint, every accusation was undeniable. And when those words were spoken, they acted like a mirror held up to the face of the entire unit, reflecting back years of concealment, of closed eyes, of internal decisions that buried the voices of the public. Outside the meeting room, the hallway was quiet, only the footsteps of staff passing by, but inside, the air was so thick it could be cut into pieces. The senior officers leaned back in their chairs, eyes dulled, realizing the truth was devouring everything they once believed to be secure. The younger ones, who had once clung to the illusion that the uniform was a shield, were now seeing that very shield had become their chain. They remained silent, but that silence was no longer personal. It was the outcome of a system that had lasted too long. The truth, confirmed in that moment, stretched beyond the four walls, because all it took was one investigator to document it, one line in a report sent forward, and the entire country would know that the cracks didn't start with a woman named Grant. They started with the very structure that enabled her. Each bowed head in that room, though voiceless, was still part of that system. And once that truth saw daylight, no one would have the strength to bury it again. In the brightly lit room of a mid-tier law office, Grant sat in an armchair, her face tense but still clinging to an air of arrogance. Newspapers lay scattered across the table, all bearing bold headlines about her case. Television cameras had captured Grant's trembling gaze in the courtroom, and now that image was everywhere. Her personal attorney, a graying man, tried to calm her in a steady tone, advising her to make a public statement claiming the entire incident was a fabricated setup. Grant leaned back in the chair, arms crossed, and snapped, "I was framed." The words echoed in the closed room, but they lacked the weight to drown out the roar from outside where public outrage was surging. Immediately after the statement, Grant's legal team released a carefully edited video. The clip was shortened, the shouting removed, the violent actions masked, leaving only footage of Leah bending down to pick up her book. A caption running beneath the video claimed Leah had fabricated the story for attention, and that Grant's reactions had been selectively edited to appear incriminating. The law office pushed the clip through a few minor media outlets, hoping to plant seeds of doubt. They believed that even the faintest suggestion of uncertainty could ease the mounting pressure. But as the clip spread, the backlash was fiercer than they expected. The public had grown used to such editing tactics and quickly spotted the manipulation. Those present in the courtroom spoke out in unison, affirming they had witnessed Grant pulling Leah's hair and shouting insults. On social media, countless users posted side-by-side comparisons of the original and edited clips, exposing the deception. Tech experts swiftly analyzed the footage, identifying critical missing frames. The lies were too obvious to ignore, and this attempt at a counterattack only poured more fuel on the fire. Inside the law office, the atmosphere turned chaotic. Several young assistants exchanged anxious looks as critical comments flooded their screens. They knew that instead of calming the storm, releasing the clip had only intensified public outrage. Each claim of fabrication was met with hundreds of eyewitness accounts and the unedited video. Outside, major news networks dissected the footage, broadcasting the full, untouched version and confirming its authenticity. The truth stood undeniable, while Grant's team sank deeper into the mess they had created. Grant continued to maintain a defiant tone in brief interviews. She looked straight into the camera, repeating the familiar refrain, "I am the victim of a systemic smear campaign." But her eyes no longer held the confidence they once did. Instead, they revealed a strained unease that viewers quickly picked up on. Within an hour of the interview airing, tens of thousands of mocking comments flooded in. Her statement was clipped, edited, and turned into satirical sound bites, spreading across the internet as a viral joke. The wave of public backlash surged, turning the law office into a hotspot surrounded by reporters and protesters. Signs were held high outside the entrance, slogans like "Justice isn't an edit job" and "Don't make victims into criminals" swaying with each shouted chant. Every time Grant looked out through the window, she saw the outrage had grown far beyond control, and in that moment, she realized her weak declarations and doctored footage were no longer enough to save her, because the truth had slipped from her grasp and taken root in the collective will of a community united for justice. As soon as the edited clip was released, social media reacted like wildfire. Attentive users quickly placed the two video versions side by side, analyzing each frame, amplifying every sound. Tech experts and independent fact-checking platforms joined in, clearly proving that Grant's clip had been altered, cutting out the scenes where she yanked Leah's hair and shouted in front of the courtroom. Side-by-side comparisons flooded timelines, red arrows circling every missing frame, making it impossible for viewers to deny what had happened. Across the web, people declared, "This is the original proof, undeniable." The exposure spread like a shockwave, extinguishing every attempt to spark doubt. The public's anger only intensified. Rather than being swayed by Grant's defense, they became more certain she was trying to deceive the entire country. Every post online carried a tone of fury. You pull a girl's hair and then claim innocence? If this is how an officer behaves, who are they protecting? Rebuttal videos were shared millions of times, and the image of Grant facing undeniable evidence became a symbol of failure, a reminder of the futility of clinging to lies. Major news outlets quickly joined in. Instead of reporting neutrally, this time they published long-form pieces dissecting the inconsistencies in her defense. One respected publication wrote, "If the video was edited that precisely, it's not a mistake. It's a deliberate act to conceal the truth." The article was widely cited, adding immense pressure. Political commentators on television echoed the sentiment. The counterattack has collapsed because the truth cannot be manipulated. Inside Grant's law office, the atmosphere turned bleak. The once confident assistants now typed quietly, avoiding eye contact. They understood the situation had spiraled beyond control. Even those who had long remained loyal began to waver, fearing that defending Grant now was no different from being complicit. Calls from reporters came flooding in, all demanding a response, but no answer could calm the storm that was rapidly building. Out in society, faith in Grant collapsed swiftly. The public, already weary from stories of abuse of power, now had an unfiltered example right before their eyes. The police uniform, once a symbol of protection for the community, now appeared to be a mask for deception, and Grant became the poster figure of that decay. Protests erupted across major cities, with banners demanding not just justice for Leah, but also transparency and deep reform. Grant's isolation became visible in every moment. When she stepped outside her office, camera lenses aimed directly at her, flash after flash, voices shouting questions without pause. Every step she took was met with fierce rejection, and no one stood by her side anymore. She tried to maintain a firm expression, but her eyes wandered and her trembling lips betrayed the fear within. That image quickly went viral, becoming a symbol of the downfall of an officer once arrogantly convinced of her own untouchability. The loss of trust was beyond repair. From the public to the media to her own colleagues, everyone had turned away. Grant not only failed to defend herself, but she also actively dragged herself deeper into disgrace through her own deception. In that moment, the public no longer saw her as an isolated individual, but as proof of the price any abuser of power would inevitably face. That morning, the federal courthouse was packed. The long hallway lit up under bright lights, every hurried footstep echoing through the tense atmosphere. Outside, crowds gathered in front of a large temporary screen, chants mixing with the sound from broadcast speakers. For the first time in weeks, all eyes turned to a single place where Grant would finally face justice. As the courtroom doors opened, she stepped in with a stiff expression, stripped of her usual arrogance. Television cameras followed her every move, broadcasting the image live across the nation. Inside the chamber, the jury sat in solemn silence, the judge watching from the bench, and the prosecutor neatly arranged a thick stack of files. On Grant's side, her legal team laid out piles of documents like a final line of defense, but everyone knew the evidence this time was far too clear to twist. When the first gavel strike echoed through the room, the courtroom fell silent, broken only by the faint hum of the cameras. In that moment, Grant was officially placed before justice, with nowhere left to hide. The prosecutor began calmly but firmly. He recounted the events of that day in the courtroom, detailing Grant's actions before hundreds of witnesses. Then, Without delay, he called for the full video to be played. The room darkened, the only light coming from the large screen at the center. The footage began with Leah clutching a book as she entered, followed by Grant blocking her path and hurling verbal abuse. The audience held its breath, every eye fixed on the screen, missing nothing. When the moment arrived, Grant yanking Leah's hair, the room erupted in whispers of outrage. The sounds in the video were unmistakable. The book hitting the floor, a gasp from the audience, all combining into a living indictment. Some in the gallery instinctively covered their mouths, and others shook their heads in disbelief that such behavior happened inside a court of law. Online, millions watched the live feed, flooding the chat with comments. There's nothing left to deny. Justice must win today. The defense team tried to argue that the clip might be taken out of context, but audience protests forced them into silence. The judge struck the gavel, calling for order, yet it was clear the scales of justice had already tipped. Grant sat at the defendant's table, hands clenched, her face pale as her own image was projected for the world to see. Her past words echoed clearly through the microphone. "You've got no one. You're just a trembling black girl." That voice now returned as the final, unanswerable proof of a truth beyond any defense. When the video ended, the lights in the courtroom came back on, but the atmosphere remained heavy as lead. The prosecutor turned to the jury, voice firm. "This is no longer testimony. This is undeniable truth." The live broadcast captured that moment in full, and millions of viewers watching knew the case had entered an irreversible stage. Grant had faced justice through the very actions she once believed would stay hidden. And from that moment on, no one doubted the outcome that lay ahead. One by one, witnesses took the stand, each voice steady, each gaze unwavering, like driving nails into the door of truth. The middle-aged woman who sat in the gallery that day stated clearly before the entire courtroom that she saw Officer Grant grab Leah's hair, pull hard enough to make the girl stumble, and then hurl vicious words. Her voice rang through the microphone, not shaking but sharp, cutting through Grant's crumbling defense like a blade. Then came a law student who had filmed the incident, holding the phone high for the court to see, pointing out each moment Leah was overwhelmed. His eyes red, but his voice firm. She didn't do anything first. It all started with Officer Grant. Another young attorney, seated near the bench that day, described in detail how he heard the insults and the thud of the book hitting the floor. He spoke slowly, each word poured into the room as a reminder that truth does not belong to those who abuse power, but to those who bear witness. Their testimonies didn't simply echo one another, they completed each other, rebuilding a vivid, undeniable picture. Leah was attacked first, and everything that followed stemmed from that single violent act. The courtroom fell into a deep silence after each statement, as though every sound had been compressed into stillness. Cameras zoomed in on Grant's face, where once rigid features were now tightening, and anxious eyes betrayed the calm facade. Jurors took careful notes, some nodding as testimonies aligned precisely with the footage shown. The silence wasn't indifference, it was a form of reverence for truth, as if everyone present was witnessing the final mask being stripped away. Outside, viewers watching the live broadcast held their breath. Millions kept their eyes fixed on the evidence and the words spoken, and the usual flood of comments slowed to a focused hush. No further accusations were needed because the truth had already been cemented through video, through testimony, through the presence of those who had been there that day. It all came together like a complete puzzle, forming a silent verdict long before the judge ever spoke. When the final witness finished their testimony, the courtroom sank into an unusual moment of silence. No coughs, no shifting chairs, only a stillness so absolute it made hearts pound inside chests. That silence was the sign of justice, an unspoken agreement that the truth had been laid bare, undeniable. In that moment, Officer Grant was no longer a police officer with a badge on her shoulder, but a defendant exposed under the light, drowned by honest testimony. And it was that very silence, louder than any condemnation, that declared justice had arrived in the room. The sound of the gavel struck against the silent walls, each thud heavy like nails, sealing the last remnants of resistance. The judge rose, his eyes sweeping across the packed courtroom, his voice firm and resonant. After reviewing all evidence and witness testimony, the court finds the defendant, Officer Grant, guilty of assault and abuse of power in the execution of her duties. The words fell like the final hammer blow, shattering the wall of denial. Grant sat motionless, her face pale, hands gripping the edge of her chair with a visible tremble, but not a word left her lips. The shell of power that once protected her collapsed in that instant, revealing the image of someone stripped bare before justice. The first sound came from outside, an eruption of cheers like crashing waves. The crowd gathered at the courthouse gates, watching through the giant screen, burst into celebration at the word guilty. They raised signs reading "Justice for Leah," flags waved in the wind, and chants echoed through the square. Weeks of pent-up outrage gave way to a surge of triumph. Some cried, others embraced, knowing this verdict wasn't just for Leah, proof that truth could still overcome the abuse of power. Inside the courtroom, the jury bowed their heads, and the judge struck the gavel once more to confirm the final decision. The spectators sat in silence for a moment, then applause broke out. Though the judge called for order, the sound couldn't be silenced. It carried the weight of relief, applause, welcoming a new era of justice. Leah sat in the gallery, holding her book tightly, eyes glistening but gaze steady. She didn't cry. She knew this was only the beginning, but her strength had been validated with an official verdict. Grant stood, her wrists immediately locked in gleaming handcuffs. The cameras caught it all, broadcasting the image across the nation, turning it into a symbol of collapse. The woman who once shouted slurs in the courtroom now bowed her head in silence, each step out the door heavy with shame. The crowd outside saw it all on the screen and roared, chanting, "Justice! Justice!" as the sound shook the courthouse walls. No one believed anymore that a badge could shield wrongdoing, because today's verdict proved otherwise. As the cheers spread outward, the whole city seemed to beat with one heart. People watching from home, in cafes, on buses, rose to their feet as if standing outside the courthouse themselves. Social media exploded with millions of shares, the phrase "Grant found guilty" flooding every corner. Photos of the moment became headline news, marking the day silence was broken and justice was no longer just an abstract slogan. The final gavel strike ended the trial, but its echo lingered. In Leah's eyes, in the cheers of the crowd, in the words spreading across social media, people understood that this was not just a verdict for one individual. It was a declaration that truth still exists, that justice may be delayed but never lost. And in that moment, society bore witness to a historic turning point, where abusive power was brought to its knees by the unwavering force of justice. The cold clink of metal rang sharply as the handcuffs locked tightly around Grant's wrists. That sound echoed through the courtroom like a bell tolling the end of unchecked authority, while also signaling a new beginning, one where justice was no longer a vague promise. She flinched, her body stiffened, and the once proud shoulders slumped under the weight of cold steel. Camera lights lit up the scene, capturing the moment when someone who once stood atop the ranks of power was now a convicted criminal being escorted in full view of the public. The collapse was unmistakable, leaving no refuge for arrogance. In the gallery, a wave of emotion surged. People exhaled deeply, as if emerging from a long nightmare. Eyes once filled with worry and anger now showed satisfaction and relief. Phones were raised to capture every second, preserving the image of those cold cuffs as a permanent memory. They didn't just bind a pair of wrists, they symbolized the moment justice finally gripped the hand of abusive power and left it with no room to escape. Meanwhile, Leah sat quietly inside, still holding her worn-out book tightly. That law book was no longer just a prop for comfort, but a symbol of Justice's quiet resolve. Her eyes glowed under the courtroom lights, no longer trembling like that first day in the hallway. She looked straight at Grant, not with hatred, but with firm belief that justice had been served. In that moment, she was no longer a lone girl standing her ground, but the face of millions whose voices had been silenced. The image of Leah sitting in the courtroom, clutching her book, her eyes lit in the moment of the verdict, was broadcast across every major news channel. People everywhere saw it and felt a power stronger than any bias. A young black girl, once humiliated in the very halls of justice, had now become a living symbol of the belief truth can still prevail. Her story was no longer a private tragedy. It had become a guiding light for an entire society. Outside the courthouse, as the doors swung open and Grant was escorted away, the roar of the crowd erupted. They weren't just celebrating the punishment of one person, but embracing the confirmation that the voice of the people had made a difference. In that chorus of cheers, the image of Leah shining in the courtroom became a milestone, reminding everyone that resistance is necessary and silence equals complicity. Leah's tight embrace of the book wasn't just a gesture of holding on to a keepsake, but a reminder that justice always needs those willing to hold on to it with unwavering resolve. The handcuffs clicked shut. Leah's eyes lit up, and those two images merged like a painting of contrast and connection. On one side, the collapse of a figure who had abused power. On the other, the rise of faith and strength. And, from that very moment, the story moved beyond a single case, leaving its mark on the hearts of millions, as living proof that justice may be challenged, but it will always find its way to prevail. As the verdict was delivered, news outlets around the globe simultaneously ran bold headlines across their screens. Justice makes no exceptions. Images of Grant being led out of the courthouse in handcuffs and Leah clutching her book with shining eyes were splashed across the front pages of major international newspapers. Television channels replayed the moment the gavel struck, framing it as a turning point, not just for America, but as a wake-up call about abuse of power in law enforcement worldwide. Reporters packed the front of the federal courthouse, and breaking news segments aired non-stop, repeatedly mentioning Leah's name alongside the message that truth had prevailed. Press conferences, international human rights organizations quickly issued statements of praise. They called it a clear demonstration that no one stands above justice, not even those in uniform and wearing a badge. These organizations went beyond celebration, urging governments to re-examine their systems of police oversight and calling for deeper structural reforms. Praise for Leah became widespread, with many viewing her as a new symbol of a young generation unafraid to confront injustice. Social and legal experts also appeared on television to comment. They said this case would go down in history as a defining example of how a single individual can ignite widespread change. Leah was recognized as the central figure, but the trial also highlighted the gaps in the justice system. Some analysts stressed that the verdict against Grant was not the end, but the beginning of a broader dialogue on accountability and reform. These insights fueled further public discourse, pushing the story beyond a single courtroom into the realm of nationwide conversation. Meanwhile, social media continued to explode. The hashtag #Justice for Leah, already viral, became even more widespread, appearing across international platforms. Users from various countries shared footage from the trial, commenting on the global importance of the verdict. Artists, writers, and politicians posted statements affirming this as a collective victory for human rights. These posts created a ripple effect, making the media Aftershock extend far beyond America's borders, turning it into a focal point of global attention. Amid the storm of public reaction, the image of Leah standing in court, clutching her book with shining eyes, emerged emerged as a symbol of hope. She didn't need powerful speeches or dramatic gestures. Her steady presence alone became a source of inspiration. The media hailed her as a proof that justice is not an abstract concept, but something that can be defended through courage. From that moment on, the name Leah Carter echoed far and wide, no longer confined to a courtroom, but remembered across the world as a shining example of truth and determination. In the days following the verdict, public forums, from universities and coffee shops to city halls, became spaces for discussions about police reform. People didn't stop at the satisfaction of seeing Grant held accountable. They began asking bigger questions. How had the system allowed someone like her to thrive unchecked for so long, and where should change begin to ensure it never happens again? Legal scholars, sociologists, and everyday citizens joined the debate, proposing stronger independent oversight, tighter recruitment and training protocols, and a greater emphasis on transparency in all law enforcement operations. Media outlets ran continuous talk shows where viewers called in to share their thoughts. A suburban mother said she didn't want her son to be afraid every time he walked past a police station. A law professor observed that Grant's conviction was just the beginning of a long road toward reform. Those conversations quickly turned into action. In many major cities, citizens organized into groups to draft petitions to local governments, demanding the creation of independent police oversight boards. Community organizations hosted open forums where people could speak directly with local officials. The atmosphere was energetic but not chaotic, united by a shared goal: sustainable change, not a brief flare-up. A spirit of solidarity was evident as people of different races, professions, and social classes sat side by side, listening to each other's stories and searching for solutions together. From forums and petitions, a wave of peaceful protests began spreading across the country. On main streets, thousands held up signs with bold slogans: "Justice has no privilege, reform now, not later." The protests remained orderly, marked not by shouting or thrown objects, but by songs, drums, and steady footsteps. Police were stationed along sidewalks, but this time, under close media scrutiny, they didn't dare act aggressively. Images of law enforcement lined up across from vast crowds of peaceful demonstrators with no clashes became powerful evidence of the strength of nonviolence. Television broadcasts covered many of the marches live, capturing young faces chanting next to heads of silver hair. Children walked hand in hand with their parents. Young adults draped banners over their shoulders, and elders raised their canes to match the pace. Each person brought their own story, yet all contributed their voice to a chorus of justice. Overhead, news helicopters circled, capturing the image of a procession stretching like a river through the streets, creating an undeniable wave of momentum. That wave didn't stop at national borders, but instead inspired movements around the world. Cities across Europe, Asia, and Africa held small marches, raising signs translated into their own languages, reminding everyone that justice is not the private matter of one country alone. Leah became a name chanted in many public squares, a symbol of courage and resolve. Every step taken in the streets was a declaration that society would no longer accept silence, that belief in justice had become a shared strength, spreading far and wide and urging real change. The university auditorium was bathed in bright lights, with hundreds of students filling the wooden seats, their eyes fixed on the podium as Leah Carter emerged. In her familiar posture, she held the law book tightly against her chest, her hands holding it as if it were part of her own being. The light fell across her face, making her appear both solemn and approachable. Gone were the cheers heard in the square. Here, silence held court, an atmosphere of reverence as the younger generation prepared to listen to history's witness. Leah began speaking in a measured but clear tone, each word weighted with lived experience. She recounted the terror terror of being stopped in the courthouse hallway. How, even with her heart pounding and hands trembling, she clung to the book as her only support. She described the moment her hair was yanked, the humiliation that seized her, and the chilling stillness when she realized every eye in the courtroom was on her. Yet, instead of collapsing, she stood firm, because deep inside she believed that justice is not a privilege earned, but a right held by all. Her words brought the auditorium to a hush. Many students lowered their heads, some gripping their hands as if they could feel the trembling Leah had endured. She did not seek to paint herself as a hero. She simply shared her fear, then stressed that resilience is the strongest weapon. If I remained silent, the story would be buried, she said, but by speaking out, it became the voice of millions. The sincerity in her voice left the room breathless, and many young faces glistened with tears. Leah went on to underline that the youth are the impetus keeping justice from breaking. She gazed directly at the crowd, her eyes bright, affirming that all change begins with one small decision: to not bow down, to speak the truth. The image of the young woman hugging a worn book became a living testament to that belief. The auditorium's mood shifted, not from tense silence but toward a stirring energy, as though each heart had been kindled. Eyes met eyes, breaths soft but eager, a wave of spirit spreading, urging each person to believe in their own power. When Leah paused, the silence held for a few more seconds before applause broke out. The claps didn't stop but grew into a unified rhythm, a pledge that these students would not let justice be trampled silently. Leah bowed in gratitude, still holding her book, a faint smile on her lips and her eyes still shining. In that moment, she was no longer just a storyteller. She became a spark of motivation for an entire generation yearning for change. A hand rose from the front row, and a student's voice rang out clearly in the expectant auditorium. Do you regret it? If you had stayed silent that day, you wouldn't have faced danger, endured humiliation, or become the focal point of all this attention. The question echoed, direct, unavoidable, as though voicing the silent concerns of many other young people. The entire hall fell silent, all eyes turning to Leah, waiting to see how she would answer such a weighty question. Leah stood still for a few seconds, clutching the book in her hands, her gaze dipping before lighting up. She did not shy away or soften the situation. Her voice was steady and clear. No, I do not regret it. Justice is worth the risk. The brief yet resolute answer cut through the wall of doubt like an arrow, freezing the hall in its power. No one stirred or whispered. Everyone was captivated by the strength of her words. Her reply was more than a denial of regret. It was a living declaration. She continued, "If I had bowed down to avoid suffering, I would have empowered injustice to continue ruling. If I remained silent, millions would believe that silence is the only way to survive. But by choosing to risk it all, I opened a door for all of us to believe that we have the right to stand up." Those words resonated through the vast space, shifting the atmosphere from tense to energized. Many students looked at one another, their eyes shining with empathy and emotion. Some nodded emphatically, others wiped away tears, and still others clenched their hands as if making a promise to themselves. Leah's affirmation became a spiritual jolt, a reminder that justice never comes from compromising with fear. Many in that room had once remained silent before injustice, and today they felt the urge to change, to never repeat that silence again. Applause rose gradually, starting scattered, then building into thunderous rounds. Students sprang to their feet, cheers echoing through the enclosed space in an unstoppable wave of emotion. Leah smiled softly, her eyes shining under the lights, still holding her book as though it had become proof of her decision not to regret. In that moment, she answered not just a personal question, but gave a universal lesson to all. Courage often demands a price, but the value of justice is always greater than any fear. The auditorium glowed not just from the lights, but from a newly ignited sense of belief. Leah stepped down from the podium to the sound of her name being called out, leaving behind a generation of students with steadier eyes and hearts burning with purpose. Her answer would not be forgotten. It would become a line repeated for years to come. a reminder that justice is not a gift handed down, but a goal to be claimed, even at the cost of everything. Inside the newly inaugurated Museum of Justice Reform, gentle lighting illuminated transparent display cases preserving artifacts tied to that historic turning point. At its center, Leah Carter's old law book was displayed with reverence, its cover worn but still sturdy, symbolizing the enduring strength of justice. Below it, a brief plaque read, "A symbol of unbroken faith." Visitors stood silently before the glass, gazing at the book, once trembling in a young woman's hands as she faced humiliation and violence, now elevated into a treasure cherished by society. Nearby, a large screen played a loop of the video capturing the shocking hair pull moment. Officer Grant gripping Leah's hair, the book hitting the cold marble floor, and Leah's firm reply, "Not you." That moment transcended the courtroom, serving as living proof of abused authority and the courage to stand up. Many viewers watched with chills, some covering their mouths, others wiping tears, moved because they understood how that truth had changed an entire system. This exhibit didn't just recount Leah's story, it opened a broader narrative about the reform journey. Lining the walls were newspaper clippings, photos, human rights appeals, scenes from peaceful protests, and transparency petitions. Each item formed a piece of a larger puzzle, one illustrating how a single personal incident evolved into a societal awakening. It reminded people that history isn't shaped by empty promises, but by concrete actions and those brave enough to take the first step. Among the visitors were law students, young lawyers, and families bringing their children to learn and reflect. They pointed to the book in its display and explained that it stands for a generation that turns fear into strength. A young boy watched the video screen intently and asked his father, "Why would someone do that to her?" His father quietly replied, "Because injustice always exists, but what's important is that we did not let it win." Such small conversations echoed throughout the hall, planting in the young a belief that justice is always worth preserving. Leah's legacy doesn't lie in unintended fame, but in tangible change. An independent oversight board was established, police academies now include human rights training, and the complaint process was overhauled. These reforms were showcased in the exhibit as the next chapter in the story, evidence that the hair pull was not just an act of cruelty, but the spark that ignited meaningful reform. Inside the Museum of Justice Reform, many left with a mix of choked-up emotion and quiet pride. They didn't just remember Leah as a key figure in a court case, but as the person who ignited a spark for real change. That worn book and the video were no longer simply visual records. They had become spiritual relics, a reminder that justice requires people brave enough to defend it, and that steadfast action can shake a whole system. Footsteps echoed softly against the museum's polished stone floors. Visitors paused before the glass display housing the law book, now the focal point of the exhibit. A middle-aged woman nodded as she rested her gaze on the book, her lips moving in silent acknowledgement. A trial that changed America. The words carried softly but spread quickly, prompting others to nod in agreement. Murmurs flowed around the room like an unspoken chant, reminding everyone they were witnessing history. They had come not only to view an artifact, but to remind themselves that justice can be restored, and that what once seemed impossible had been proven possible in a single courtroom. School groups arrived, accompanied by their teachers, their eyes bright as the story unfolded. One teacher pointed to the video replaying the moment Leah lifted her head in defiance, explaining how a young person can spark major change when they speak up. The children listened closely, a few whispering to each other that they wanted to become lawyers, to protect those without power. In another corner, an elderly war veteran stood quietly before the screen for a long time, his deep eyes reflecting a belief that a new generation was now continuing the fight he once dreamed of but couldn't complete. International media continued to cover the museum and its story. Leah Carter was no longer referred to merely as the victim in a high-profile case, but was hailed as a symbol of resilience and unyielding justice. The image of the young woman clutching her book in the courtroom, her eyes shining with defiance, appeared on the covers of prestigious magazines with headlines like "The Girl Who Changed America" and "Truth Stronger Than Power." Those phrases were echoed on the radio, in editorials, and across airwaves, ensuring Leah Carter's name came to represent something far greater than a single legal battle. In the hearts of the people, Leah became proof that even those most dismissed can rise to become a guiding torch. The silence that once filled the courthouse hallways on the day she was humiliated has now turned into loud declarations affirming that justice cannot be buried. Her story is retold in classrooms, around family dinner tables, and in coffee shop conversations, used as an example to teach children that true strength doesn't come from surface-level power, but from faith and courage. Leah doesn't need to stand on a pedestal to be praised. Her image in the hearts of the people is enough to define resilience. The museum gradually became a spiritual pilgrimage site, a place where every visitor feels they are part of a larger transformation. And Leah, though not physically present every day, remains there in the eyes of admiration, in the quiet retelling of her story, in the belief that justice is real. From a girl clutching a book and walking into a courthouse hallway full of fear, Leah has become a symbol not only of America, but of an era brave enough to face the dark in search of light. In the hearts of the people, Leah became living proof that even those most dismissed can rise to become a guiding light. The silence that once filled the courthouse hallways on the day she was humiliated has now transformed into loud declarations affirming that justice cannot be buried. Her story is retold in classrooms, around family dinner tables, and in coffee shop conversations, used to teach children that true strength does not come from surface power, but from faith and courage. Leah does not need to stand on a pedestal to be celebrated. Her image in the hearts of many defines resilience itself. The museum gradually became a spiritual pilgrimage site, where every visitor felt part of the movement for change. And Leah, though not physically present each day, remains there, in the admiring glances, in the whispered retellings, in the belief that justice is real. From a girl clutching a book and entering that fearful courthouse hallway, Leah has become a symbol, not just of America, but of an era brave enough to face darkness in pursuit of light. As visitors exited the museum, their emotions were a mix of chagrin and pride. They did not just recall Leah as a central figure in a trial, but as the spark of meaningful change. That worn book and video had evolved into spiritual relics, reminders that justice needs people brave enough to protect it, and that resolute action can shake even the strongest system. Their footsteps echoed softly on the polished stone floors as they paused before the glass case holding the law book, which had transformed into the exhibit's focal point. A middle-aged woman gazed at the book and whispered to herself, "A trial that changed America." Her words quietly spread, prompting nods of agreement. Quiet murmurs filled the room like an unspoken chorus, reminding all who were present that they were standing at a historical milestone. People didn't come only to view an artifact, they came to remember that justice can be restored, and that what once seemed impossible was proven possible in a single courtroom. Teachers led groups of law students and young lawyers through the exhibit, their eyes bright as they heard the story. One teacher pointed to the video replaying the moment Leah lifted her head and faced her oppressor, explaining that even a young person can spark great change by speaking out. Children listened intently. Some whispered they wanted to become lawyers to protect the vulnerable. In one corner, an older war veteran stood silently before the screen, his eyes deep with belief that a new generation was continuing a struggle he had dreamed of but couldn't fully complete. The father gently tilted his head, his eyes revealing a rare tenderness seldom shown in public, and whispered, "Justice begins with the smallest act of courage." His words echoed in the warmth of the room, offering closure to all that Leah had endured. It wasn't a stirring speech. It was simple and soft, yet cut straight to the heart. Leah remained quiet, eyes brimming as those words sank deep, reminding her that her journey was not in vain, and even the small act of gripping her book in her hand to stand firm became the very beginning of great change. A hush settled over the room, but it carried warmth rather than heaviness. The fire crackled softly, echoing the deep, silent emotions shared between them. Leah rested her head on her father's shoulder, still clutching the book, feeling both like a little girl who had found support and a woman who had learned that true strength begins with fragile steps. In that moment, no words were needed. Just being together made everything clear. He sat there quietly, soaking in his daughter's warmth, knowing Leah had come farther than he ever imagined. From a trembling girl in a courthouse hallway, she had become a symbol of an entire movement. He could not hide his pride, yet he knew the weight she carried. That phrase, "Justice begins with the smallest act of courage," was both encouragement and a reminder that the road ahead remained long, and Leah must hold on to that spirit, resisting the pull of fame or outside pressure. Leah closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, engraving her father's words onto her heart. She understood that her legacy was not just about the events themselves, or the book she held, or the video that changed the nation, but that simple lesson. Without that small act of courage, there would have been no wave of change. That thought brought a gentle smile to her lips, equal parts gratitude and determination. In that small room, the two sat side by side, golden firelight wrapping around them like a soft blanket. A warm stillness stretched between them, giving both space to imprint those emotions. Outside, the world raged on with protests, news, and debates. But here, in that quiet moment, Leah found the peace she needed to move forward, and her father found reassurance that his daughter was strong enough to carry the path ahead. And in that simple moment, Justice felt re-energized, nourished by the love of a family. The vast square glowed with the light of thousands of small candles, flickering like a sea of flame, each flame linking with the next to form an unbroken current. People stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes turned toward the raised platform where Leah Carter appeared, her demeanor calm but her gaze ablaze. She held the law book tightly to her chest, her grip firm as if to remind herself that her path didn't end with a trial, a verdict, or a personal victory, but marked the beginning of a long journey toward justice. In the silent space, Leah spoke, her voice clear and unwavering. Justice is not a slogan. Each word sliced through the air like a sharp blade, holding the crowd in breathless attention. As her final word rang out, a thunderous cheer erupted across the square. Thousands of voices repeated the phrase in unison, the sound rolling like a wave, powerful enough to shake the ground. Candles were raised high, their flames merging into a blazing sea of light pushed back the heavy darkness. Leah stood firm, looking out over the crowd lit with belief, sensing a great force that no longer belonged to her alone. It had become a shared fire carried by an entire generation. Within the chants, Leah could see the change taking root. Those who had once stayed silent were now standing tall. Those who had once trembled were now holding hands tightly, illuminating the square together. This was no longer a gathering to condemn one police officer, but a celebration of justice itself, where every person brought their own flame to affirm their belief in truth. Leah took a deep breath, feeling the warmth from the flames reach her heart, knowing her mission was not just to confront injustice, but to pass the fire on to everyone. A song rose from one corner of the square, hesitant at first, then swelling into a chorus that blended with the chanting and the light, forming a vivid and unforgettable scene. Leah smiled, her eyes brimming but resolute, knowing that what happened tonight would echo for years to come. For when justice is spoken by thousands of different voices, it is no longer fragile. It becomes an unstoppable force. In that moment, Leah stepped back, quietly watching the crowd ablaze, letting the shared fire take center stage. She understood understood she had only lit the spark, and the journey now belonged to everyone. And, in the flickering candlelight, amid the relentless chanting, Leah knew her story had come to a close, but its legacy would live on, like the final flame that never goes out. Leah's smile lit up the night, radiating a gentle yet fierce light that outshone any candle burning in the square. Her face bore no trace of fear or tension, only a deep calm, as if, after everything she had endured, she had finally found her own answer. That image etched itself into the minds of the thousands present and of those watching through live broadcast as an unforgettable symbol. Amid the sea of voices calling out, Leah stood tall, and that smile became the emblem of a victory born not from power, but from faith and courage. That moment marked not just the end of a trial, but the beginning of a new chapter for society. People left the square in candlelight, carrying with them the belief that justice had been affirmed, that injustice could be defeated when people no longer bowed to it. Many whispered that they would never forget the image of Leah standing in the square, her radiant smile seeming to declare that truth had finally prevailed. The story had closed, yet its echo lingered in every step, every heartbeat of those who had witnessed it. In the days that followed, Leah's smile appeared everywhere, from magazine covers and news broadcasts to murals painted by the youth. It was more than just a face. It was a living message that anyone, no matter how small, could become a guiding flame. Younger generations looked to Leah and saw courage, while older ones recognized that hope still lived in a society where people like her dared to rise. And, over time, the story of Leah Carter came to be remembered not just as a landmark in legal history, but as a lasting lesson for every generation. Teachers told students that a smile could shift the way a whole society sees the world, that justice doesn't live on paper, but in the hearts of those willing to defend it. Around dinner tables, in lectures, in the pages of new books, the story's echo continued. When night fell over the city, and the square now held only the traces of burned-out candles, something still lingered in the air. It was an invisible flame, sparked by Leah's final smile, a flame passed from generation to generation, from one heart to another. And so the story closed, but its resonance remained, so that whenever someone stands before injustice, they'll remember that once a girl stood tall and smiled in the dark, offering humanity an unshakable faith in justice. As the final light of the last candle faded, the story of Leah Carter continued to echo in the hearts of millions. From a young woman entering a courthouse hallway with a law book in her hands, Leah endured a storm of trials where humiliation and violence nearly brought her down. But, at her most vulnerable point, she found the strength to rise. The intense confrontation with Officer Grant, the degrading hair grab, and the defiant words spoken in court ignited a spark that set an entire movement ablaze. When Leah revealed the identity of her father, the United States Attorney General, the truth broke open, and the entire nation was shaken. From that moment on, justice was no longer an abstract concept, but something alive in every phone recording, every chant in the streets, and every message shared across social media. The viral video sparked not only outrage, but a renewed belief that injustice could be exposed. The Attorney General's public declaration that power could not shield wrongdoing stirred the public even more, opening the door to an unprecedented investigation. The truth about Grant's history of abuse came to light, forcing the entire police system to confront questions it had long avoided. When the final verdict was delivered, it marked not just the fall of an individual, but a turning point, affirming that justice could prevail even in the harshest environment. The image of Leah clutching the book, her eyes shining as Grant was handcuffed, became a lasting symbol in the public consciousness. But more important than that was the fire she lit, which didn't stop at the courtroom or the museum, but spread to individuals, families, and entire generations. The lesson of this journey was not that Leah was protected by her father's position, but that she chose not not to remain silent, chose to stand tall in the face of humiliation to prove that justice requires courage to survive. From one solitary moment, she helped shift how people saw their rights and responsibilities. Discussions on police reform, school lectures, and engraved messages in museums all traced back to Leah's decision that day. The story may have ended, but Leah's legacy remains vivid. It reminds us that real change doesn't come from hollow slogans, but from action and resolve under pressure. It teaches that justice isn't a gift handed down, but the outcome of struggle and collective voice. And above all, it proves that even the smallest act, a smile shining in the dark, can become a guiding light to lead a community through fear. The flame Leah left in that square will never go out, because it has been kindled in the hearts of millions who now believe justice lives not just on paper, but in the brave choices each person makes. And that is the eternal lesson. Sometimes the greatest things begin with a step so small, changes a nation.